It's ad break time. I'm pleased to announce that the Beyond Solitaire podcast remains proudly sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. And as usual, they are up to amazing things. Today, I want to especially focus on Damon Stone's upcoming class, which starts on August 28th. It's called Core Loop, Finding, Amplifying, and Refining the Fun, and it's part of CLGS's Certificate in Applied Game Design, which is made up of courses offered in collaboration with Gen Con. Damon's students absolutely love him, and he definitely knows what he's talking about. So if you can register for his class, you absolutely should. I also want to plug my own Patreon. Your support means a lot to me, both emotionally and financially. Patreon money is what makes it possible to keep improving my channel by upgrading the equipment, and I'm also hoping to increase the amount of videos I can publish over the course of the next year. If you want to help out, head over to patreon.com/BeyondSolitaire. For now, though, let's get on with the show. Hey, gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I'm here on the pod with a very special guest. This is Dr. Emily Gray. She's professor of history at Norwich University in Northfield, Vermont. How are you doing today, Emily?
I'm doing great. Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm super happy to have you on. So let's first talk about the interesting context in which you teach. So you are a non-military faculty member at a military university?
That is absolutely true. Sometimes you have these moments where you're like, how did I end up here? This is one of those. Norwich is a private military college, a 4-year military college. We also give master's degrees. So about half of our students are in a corps of cadets and wear a uniform every day on campus. About half of our students are more traditional looking students. They live more of a traditional student lifestyle. About half of our cadets will become officers in one of 5 branches of the military. We actually also have sent people to the Coast Guard and sent them to the Space Force. And some of our civilian students will do as well. So it's very highly military inflected, the world that I'm in. But before I came to teach at Norwich, I had no background in the military or anything else like that. I've come to really appreciate it and appreciate the kids that I have in my class. But it definitely their lives and their interests are very different from mine.
So how would you say the structure of teaching changes because of the environment that you're in?
Yeah, I've had to. I actually came to gaming because of trying to figure out how to reach these students that really are so very different from me. I teach mostly male students. There's quite a few female students on campus. It's, I think, 75-25, so it's kind of the opposite of most campuses. But once I get into my major, the history majors, the studies in war and peace majors, they're overwhelmingly male. So I'm teaching these boys in class who don't sit still well. I mean, there's a reason why they chose to come to a military college. Either they're playing a sport or they want to do the military stuff where they wake up at 4:00 in the morning and run 10 miles before class. That is not me, but that is very much the students that I teach. So the kind of traditional classroom where you're supposed to sit still and you're supposed to listen to a lecture, that just is that's not this group. So part of coming to gaming in a classroom and coming to reacting to the past has been me trying to figure out how to connect with these particular students and how to give them something active to do, problems to solve, so that they're moving around, they're interacting, there's an element of competition in there, so that they'll actually accidentally learn the stuff. And sometimes it is accidental. A lot of them say, I learned a lot more than I intended to. And I was like, we need to work on your intentions, but awesome. I'm glad you're learning stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I teach high school. I Jedi mind trick kids into learning things constantly, so I feel that
you totally get this. Then you totally get, how do you trick students into learning things that they don't know they want to learn until they actually learn them? But yeah, it makes for a very interesting environment, being, kind of surrounded by these military people, and then being, of course, in Vermont, in the middle of nowhere. It's a beautiful place to be, but also kind of it has its own unique culture. So It's been an interesting life, and I wouldn't have guessed that it would be the perfect place for me, but I absolutely adore my students. It's so much fun to teach them.
That is wonderful to hear. So you were making a dark confession to me before we started recording. And I'm going to make you tell
That's
everyone
right.
you're not a gamer.
I
So
am
how did
not.
you how did
This
you
is
make the
not
change?
natural for me. It's really not. I never did gaming growing up. I mean, I grew up in the 80s and 90s. I could have played Dungeons and Dragons. I never did. I was kind of generally aware of it. Even when my kids were little, I didn't want to play Candyland, like and Monopoly. Not like I didn't want to do this, and so it's very strange for me to be in this position where I'm using games in classes, and then I'm also kind of using the techniques of gaming as a way of teaching. This is another one of those moments where I look around and say, how exactly did I get here? I'm not really clear about that. But it's really the students that brought me into it. The students, of course, I think probably all students at this point are very, very versed in gaming. But these students in particular, the kinds of students that choose a military college and then choose to major in history or studies in war and peace, they've been gaming their whole lives. And so they're very good at it. And so a lot of times, this is a matter of kind of sitting down with students and saying, how do we do this? What should we do here? How do we fix this? They're constantly pushing me. They're constantly trying to break the games I'm using in class, which is really great for me because I can't get away with anything. So I know that anything I put out there is good because it's been tested through these students.
That's awesome. So do you do games other than reacting to the past?
I've done a few. I've done a few board games. I'm experimenting. I'd actually really love to do some tabletop wargaming because I'd like to use that in some teaching that I'm doing. Again, like this is not necessarily natural for me, so I'm kind of like easing into it. I'm letting students kind of lead me there, and we're kind of going with that. But mostly my experience has been with reacting to the past in class.
That's awesome.
And with that, I've used a variety of reacting to the past games. And then I've designed a couple. One is being published this fall, and another one, the one I'd like to do, the tabletop wargaming, would be related to the 1648 Peace of Westphalia, which is in process. So I've got a prototype working that through, again, with the help of students who are just really, really into, they love partnering on game design as much as they love playing the games. They love being part of the process. So that's worked out pretty well.
That's so awesome. Also, you were in the right place. You're gonna get some emails after this podcast. But so for reacting, I brought you in here mostly to talk about your
Mhm.
Augsburg game, but let's do a little bit
Mhm.
of lead up. What are some reacting to the past games that you have used previously, and why did you choose them, and what kind of won you over to the system?
Yeah, it like with, I feel like many things, I kind of got dragged into it. I had a wonderful colleague here at Norwich, actually our Roman historian, who was experimenting just a little bit with taking some time out from the long kind of like world civ kind of classes, and really doing a deep dive and doing some gaming, just some things that she had invented herself. And I said, oh, I couldn't possibly do that. There's so much I need to cover. And she said, well, go ahead and cover it. You should do whatever you want, but I'll tell you, they'll respond really well. And so after one very lackluster semester of a world civ, I thought, well, maybe we'll try something a little different. And I tried it, and I absolutely couldn't not do it after I saw how well it worked with these students and the ways that they responded to those kinds of things. I discovered reacting game when I met Professor Pat Kobe at a conference, totally unrelated to anything kind of gaming related. It was just an academic conference. And he said, oh, you should try my Henry VIII. And so that was actually my first reacting game. Sorry about that. Everything on my computer just turned off.
Oh,
But
no, I can still
you
hear
can
you.
still
You're
hear me?
good.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, you're fine.
So that was my first game. Usually people say don't start with that one because it's very complex. But I got into it and loved it, and the students loved it, and it has all these different elements, and I was trying to keep track of all the it was really kind of a baptism by fire a bit for learning how to do that. But again, the student reaction and the amount that they learned. I mean, I'm still having students coming back to me 10, 12 years later, and they're still mad about something that happened in the game. I had one student who in that first, there's an element in that game where you can actually poison someone. And
Yes.
he was poisoned by his roommate, which meant poisoned. I mean, not really poisoned. It was, it was part of the game.
Of course, of course.
And so that there had to be an intervention, and like I thought I was going to break up some roommates and like a lifelong friendship here, and I was really worried about it for a minute, and it all worked out okay. Down toward the end, and I thought, well, that's a fail. But
No, that's a
the
win.
guy came back to me 8 years later. He says, I'm out of the military. I'm now teaching high school. I want to do this with my students. And I was like, hey, you were the guy. Remember how mad you were? Yeah.
What I want to know is, are he and that roommate still friends, and do they
They are.
still
They
razz
are.
each other about this incident?
I definitely. It was also a good learning experience for me that with this particular group of students that I work with, they take everything very, very seriously. And there are certain ways that I have to do things a little bit differently than what someone might do at a typical college. What Mark Carnes is able to do at Barnard. And what I'm doing at Norwich are a little bit. I have to have certain rules and guidelines in place so that we don't have to have intervention from the RAs. But
you know what? I'm all for a little roommate betrayal. I think
I was glad that I was honestly. I mean, in addition to being grateful to hear that he's doing this with his high schoolers, I was very glad to hear that he was over it 8 years later.
Indeed. All right, so we've had a bunch of Reacting to the Past people on this podcast before, but for those of you who are kind of on ramping, just basically understand Reacting to the Past as historical LARPing in a classroom.
Yep.
And you're pretty much there.
That's essentially it. So it's a tricky way of getting students to read, especially primary sources, because they need to use them to be able to make arguments to convince other people in the class of their particular point of view. Yes. So it's a way of historical problem solving for me, using non-gamer language, which is more natural for me. It's problem solving. It's just, here's a big problem that happened in history. Here's a bunch of information that's out there. How can you use that to achieve your kinds of objectives that you're trying to get to, your victory? And it's tremendously valuable. I mean, it's the kind of thing that just it gets great responses from students. So now I can't not do it. I feel like I'm, if I go through a class and I don't use a reacting game, I feel like I've missed out on something. The students have missed out on an opportunity to learn, as well as like to become a leader, to be able to safely fail in a class. I mean, sometimes you die, metaphorically, in a reacting game. Like, you can go down in flames. And students need to know how to fail safely. And that can happen as part of this. And those other kinds of soft skills, speaking and negotiating and working together with other people and understanding a very different point of view. All of those come in as part of what they think is just a fun experience. And I know they're gaining all these amazing skills from it.
Absolutely. So you've also gone from somebody who plays reacting games in the classroom to someone who writes them. How was that transition for you? And you said you've done a couple at this point?
Well, one that's fully developed and one that's kind of on its way to being there. Once I got into them and I saw what the possibilities were, I thought, well, this is a great way to solve a problem that I'm having with teaching the Reformation, which is something that I love. I that's what I do. That's my academic background, is in the Reformation. Absolutely adore the Reformation. It's such an exciting time in history. Everything was up in the air. All these new ideas are coming out. It's all of these religious ideas are all mixed around with social and political and other kinds of concepts that are all impacting it. And I want, so like, this is so fun. This is so exciting. And I found that students were really struggling to get into it. And part, it was a whole variety of reasons why. I thought, why is it that I can't get them as excited as I am? I think part of it is they don't know how to talk about religion. Or they think it's impolite to talk about religion, right? Religion is a private matter. You don't talk about religion, especially religious difference. So these are some of the things that I think were really hard. Or, and there's also kind of a sense of like religion doesn't really matter. It's sort of a side thing that you do or don't do, and it doesn't really matter. So the idea that someone might literally be willing to die for their vision of how the Eucharist should be celebrated was something that students were not getting. Why this mattered so much to people in the 16th century. And I thought, well, maybe reacting, this pedagogy has a way in for me where I can get them to see some of these things. I can help them build this very complex world where religion is embedded in these social and economic and other kinds of things that are happening. And yeah, I thought, well, I'll give it a try.
So your game it's coming out in September?
I think it's going to be, it looks like October or November.
Okay, well, it's coming. It's coming this fall.
They promised me it'll come this fall.
Is Augsburg 1530?
Yes.
Correct? Is that like the second diet? I mean, there's lots of diets at Augsburg over time, but this is like the second one that has to do with Luther, right?
This is a big one. Luther wasn't there.
Yeah.
And actually, that was a problem in creating a Reformation game. The big people are never in the same place at the same time. Because Luther, after the Diet of Worms in 1521, he retreats to Wittenberg, and he's afraid if he leaves Wittenberg, they're going to kill him. And he's not wrong.
Legit?
They would have killed him. So he doesn't show up for things. And whenever there is something like 1529, that they get Zwingli and Luther get together in Marburg to try to see if they can come to some agreement about this whole Eucharist question. And they mostly kind of make speeches at each other and then leave. Like there isn't really any intellectual engagement. And I thought, well, it can't be done. My initial thing was, well, we can't do Reformation because it can't be done because they're not actually ever in the same place to have any kind of engagement. And then sort of immediately upon saying that, I realized I'm a social historian who works in a town that grappled with these issues. Let's take it from like up in the air theology, like all of these abstract ideas, and let's bring it down to like real on the ground, practical, how are we going to apply that in our town? And once I started thinking through it that way, it came together perfectly. So 1530 is important because there was a big Diet or Reichstag in Augsburg. This is when Charles V came in and said, we're going to solve this problem once and for all. We're going to get a bunch of people together. We're going to talk about religion. We're all going to agree that I'm right.
That's gonna go great.
Yeah, I, like with many things, it didn't go exactly as he had hoped. So he gets there. Luther's not there. Luther sends Philip Melanchthon, and there's a bunch of other people there. And Melanchthon hands Charles V a list of things he will not negotiate about. So I'm happy to talk to you about religion. I'm happy to negotiate, but these things are non-negotiables for me. And that becomes the first statement of faith for the Lutheran faith. That's the Augsburg Confession in 1530. So that's the first time that they actually got it down on paper. Like, if you're following Luther, these are the things that you're doing. So that gets presented to Charles V, and he sort of looks at it and says, well, I guess we're done here. Like, these are all the important things. And then there were a group of Swiss reformers that were like, hey, we don't agree with all of that. So they put their own confession of faith out there. And then the church got Johannes Eck, who was the only one, kind of brave enough to really go stand up and kind of go against Luther, Eck wrote a response to that. So I have these 3 beautiful documents: the Lutheran Statement of Faith, Luther doesn't go quite far enough Statement of Faith, and then the Catholic response. And they become these 3 things that came together in Augsburg, that students can use to really kind of try to get into what were the ideas that were floating around at this time. So it ended up being just a perfect spot to do that. And we're coming up on the 500th anniversary of the Augsburg Confessions. So I'm hoping that maybe people who are trying to figure out like what was going on there might pick this up and try to see the Augsburg Confession in its larger context through this game.
Oh, that's really cool. So what kind of historical people are you asking your students to embody for the purposes of this game?
So they are all members of Augsburg City Council.
Are they real people, or did you have to
They're all real people. They are all real people. So that required me to spend a lot of time in archives, which I love to do anyway, because as a historian, like this is my happy place. So I was in archives, I was in city council records, I was looking at kind of finding these people and then trying to do my best to understand their religious position. And some of them I knew, others of them I didn't really know. And so to try to figure out kind of where would they fit on the whole spectrum and try to do my best to honor these real people who really did grapple with these issues, and then give my students real people to be, so they're not fake people. It's not a fake made up situation. There are actually very few counterfactuals in the Augsburg game because there's so much good stuff there. So they're real people, they're members of the city council, and they have to grapple with the problems of all of these new religious ideas in town. What are we actually going to do in Augsburg? And they're kind of tied between these 2 poles that are challenging. On the one hand, you've got Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, very tied to Rome, very traditionally Catholic, and he's been loaned a lot of money by Augsburg bankers. I should back up and say you probably haven't heard of Augsburg because it's not important anymore, but in the 16th century it was very important. All of them important bankers in Europe lived in Augsburg. So Charles is up there and he says, look, I don't have to pay back my debts to you. I could revoke the city's independent charter if I want to, if you don't do what I say. So on the one hand, you have this person saying you've got to stay with the traditions of Rome, or the economic and political consequences are going to be dire. On the other hand, a very, very large proportion of the people in Augsburg are pretty radical revolutionaries. They want a really thorough Reformation. They're not going to be happy with just the stuff that Luther's going to give them. They want a real Reformation. And they have already risen up and had a revolt, an urban revolt in the city in the mid-1520s. For religious reasons. And so as a city council, you're stuck. On the one hand, you can't make Charles V angry. On the other hand, if you don't reform enough, you're going to have another urban revolt. So those are kind of the 2 poles that they're working in between.
This is awesome. So it actually also leads into one of the questions I wanted to ask. So I think about Roman religion mostly because I'm a classicist by training. And we talk a lot in those circles about how Roman religion is embedded and that there's very little separation of religion from politics, from just social anything. And, so we have Charles V coming and he's like, well, I won't pay you then if you don't do what I say. This actual diet, I, looked it up briefly. I'm letting you be the expert, but I noticed that there were other issues in play. Like, what do we do about the Ottomans? And like, let's have a conversation about currency and then also Christianity.
Right.
So how do you present to students that this is both a political issue and an issue of personal conviction without kind of like favoring one over the other in a way that creates a false understanding of what was going on?
Well, luckily, there's so much good material that actually happened at the time that I can pull on. So I actually do bring things in that were actual things that took place in the 1530s. Now, the Reichstag is over by the time the game begins. Everybody's gone. Charles is gone. Everybody's gone. You just have a city council looking around saying, oh no, what do we do now? Like, we've got to sort this out. We can't have this chaos. And so I have students start working through some of the issues. The first issues that they deal with are, should priests be able to be married? Are we going to allow that in Augsburg? And so then they have to deal with all of the questions about, well, what are the sacraments? Is marriage a sacrament? What do the scriptures say about marriage? All these other kinds of things. And they have to decide if they're going to be okay with priests getting married. And then the second issue, the one that students actually really love, is they have to decide whether they're going to go after people who cook sausage during Lent. Because of course, during Lent, you are not supposed to be eating meat or really any other animal products at all for 40 days of Lent. And so one of the ways that you could express, I'm not into this, I have other points of view, is to make sausage, which was very cheap and also very hard to hide. So if you're grilling sausage, all your neighbors know. So it's not something that you can just do subtly on your own inside your house. So this was actually something that Zwingli did in Switzerland during the Swiss Reformation, is he started eating sausage during Lent as a way of very publicly saying, I am not down with the system, the traditions of the church. So the city council has to decide, like, can people eat sausage? Are we going to go after the people that do eat sausage because it does create chaos in our town? Are we going to allow this? Is this okay? So it's a way of kind of taking these theological issues around sola scriptura, sola fide, all these other kinds of things that they're having to think about, and bring them down to, like, so does that mean that our priests get married? Does that mean that we're going to eat sausage? And so they're making these decisions, and they tend to go in the early part of the game. I usually get, I like to put some good, strong traditionalists in there in my traditionalist faction, but they kind of go through this. They tend to come down on the side of, like, okay, we're going to let priests marry. We're going to let sausage be eaten if people choose. But then the Bavarians come in. Augsburg is a city. It doesn't have any space except what's within the city walls. And so it can't produce its own food. It gets all of its food from Bavaria. The Dukes of Bavaria come in and say, if you're going to be reforming like this and these ideas are coming around in your city, we're not going to let our farmers trade with you. And so then they have to deal with, oh no, if we're going to let these reforms happen, food prices are going to go up. People are going to go hungry. We may end up starting a war with Bavaria. We're going to have allies. The only people who are going to ally with us are people who are going to have our same kind of religious reform system. So then all of a sudden there's this kind of stop where they have to really think about, okay, now what does this mean in terms of the economic situation that we're in, the political situation that we're in, the people that we have around us, the military alliances that we have? Are we screwed? Bavaria could come and try to take over Augsburg at any point. It's right next door. So what are we going to do? So these become, kind of ways that even in the process of trying to figure things out, they have to stop and say, whoa, hold on, what's going on here? And there's a variety of mechanisms. I know taxes seem really boring, but taxes are exciting to me. And so they can raise taxes. The best way to raise taxes is to raise taxes on beer. That's the most effective tax. And so then, they raise more money that way. So if we're going to have more soldiers to protect us, if we're going to buy more food so that people don't go hungry and revolt, we're going to have to raise taxes. So how do we do that? So then you've got all kinds of like social questions that start to come up about what kinds of taxes to do, and regressive taxes. And do we dare raise taxes on beer, or should we make the church pay taxes? So these other kinds of things come into these conversations as they start to as the Reformation rolls forward, and then creates these problems that they then have to solve in the process.
Oh, that's fun. So you talk about their kind of scope of actions they can take, problems they can solve.
Mm-hmm.
How much freedom do they have to alter historical outcomes versus how much is on rails?
I always tell them that they need to deal with the historical realities on the ground, but within that, they are welcome to do whatever they would like to do. So, they can't decide that we're just going to take all of our peasants and send them to Mars. Like, no, that's not historical realities on the ground. They have to deal with what is possible within the historical context, but within that, they can do what they want. And Augsburg's an independent city. They're welcome to come up with their own versions of these reforms. And sometimes they do that. Students will just negotiate with each other and come up with their own version. There's also a mechanism, if they want to, that they can create a multi-confessional Augsburg. They can create an Augsburg where you have people who are following the Wittenberg path and people who are following the Pope together in the same place. Because that's actually what happened historically. They couldn't just pick one, and they ended up having multiple different religious groups in their town, which was very unusual. But it happened historically. It was absolutely within historical possibilities, and it's something that they can do in the game. So with all of these reacting games, I'm for giving them as much freedom as possible within, like, practical historical, we can't create an alliance with the Chinese like that. No, that we can't do that. That's not going to happen. Even sometimes they've tried an alliance with the Ottomans, and that wouldn't fly. We couldn't do that historically. The Ottomans are too far away. So, but other kinds of alliances, I'm totally open to. Be creative, see what you can come up with, and they are.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting.
I mean, they tend to be military boys. They are steeped in gaming. They have all tried to break the games every time. So they're going to push the boundaries, and I'm pretty good at like figuring out how to let them push the boundaries as much as possible, with also kind of figuring out which boundaries are essential.
So this also makes me think, we're talking about trying to form alliances and all that. So if it's at a military school, does that mean that your students are more likely to look for military solutions, or do you find that that's not the case?
Yeah, they do tend to. They do tend to want to do that. That actually has been a problem in a couple of the other reacting games. A couple of the games that Mark Carnes designed for his students at Barnard, who tend to be sort of overwhelmingly female and just a different background. But some of the things that work well for him, I've had to alter because they immediately jump to wanting a military solution when one isn't available. I've kind of gotten around that by requiring them, ultimately, in the end, they have to create a military alliance. So they're all the way through thinking about the Reformation in terms of who are our friends and who can we ally with, and how can we use the town guard, and how can we use the mercenary soldiers that we hire to come in. And so that kind of practical problem of defense is something that I kind of put in right from the beginning, because I wrote it for my students. And I think it tends to work in other places as well, but that's kind of one way that I've gotten around it with this particular game. This is also why I'm writing a game on the Peace of Westphalia, 1648. So this was, negotiations to end the 30 Years' War, creates a whole new European state system. Very, very important period, thing that was happening. But they were absolutely moving their armies around in the field to try to influence negotiations. And so I have to have some sort of mechanism to do that, because the students know, I'm Spanish, I have these many forces, and I can totally bring them up against the Swedes if they're not giving us what we want. So trying to create some space for that, for the military play within this as well, I think is one of the reasons why it's been successful here, because they're seeing the military, as well as the economic and other kinds of implications for things that they thought were just religion, just on the side. Who cares about that? It's optional. It's not for Augsburg in the 1530s.
So one thing that we talk about is, it's historically possible to kind of end up in a religiously pluralistic city. I feel like here in the United States in the modern day, I mean, we don't practice it very well, but it's very easy to just be like, oh, well, everybody should just get to do what they want because freedom. How do you kind of help them understand that tolerance and pluralism are not necessarily natural social values that people would come to at this time? And how do you kind of mold that in the context of a game so they can experience it?
So, what's interesting? I have never had a class end up with tolerance. Really? I've never had a class end up in a pluralistic place. Other people have, but I never have. And I think that's That's because they understand that the point of this is we have to create order. Like we have to, their goal, their victory objectives are around let's figure this out so we don't have to keep fighting about it. And so the idea is to create an orderly system. And I think they get that pluralism is inherently disorderly. And it was in Augsburg. It worked out okay, but nobody was happy. Nobody liked it. Now they do. Augsburg is very proud of the fact that they actually there's a holiday in Augsburg. If you are in Augsburg on the 8th of August at any point, it's a bank holiday just for the city. It's religious toleration day, and they talk about how great it was that they were always religiously tolerant way back into history, and they sort of hate it when historians come along and they're like, actually, you guys really didn't like it. It was really awkward. You mostly hated each other. The violence was on a fairly low level, and maybe we can celebrate that. But this was no like flowering of joyous diversity until the last 15 or 20 years, and then it's been that. But yeah, anyway, so it is interesting. So Augsburg ends up pluralistic.
Right.
Nobody was happy with that solution, and
accidentally on the right side of history.
I put that in there as a possibility. I mean, again, so that they feel like there's a variety of ways in which they can act. There's a variety of outcomes, and they're always surprised. Like, what? they chose both? What? But I want to give them that broad sphere of action, but I think they get, like we gotta sort this out. We gotta fix this. We gotta create order. This isn't, it's too much going on, too much uncertainty. It's going to get in the way of our economic progress, and we can't have that. So yeah, it's never happened. I keep hoping at some point that I will get a class that actually ends up going that way. So it's interesting because I thought that would be their natural inclination because, because we live in the world we live in. So I'm hoping that it's because we've been able to create in this game a world that's immersive enough that they get the realities on the ground. They really get why that would be impossible to do.
Oh, that's really interesting. So, how do you get the students to go from game to meaningful reflection with your game? It's one of the things that's always very interesting about reacting to the past, right? It's like helping transition from we are in the game and we understand these game concepts to how do I push this to make sure this knowledge has been internalized in like a academically understandable way. So how do you like to manage that in your classes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is an interesting challenge. We do a lot of debrief after it's over. And I like to teach this game in a Reformation class. It can be taught in any number of, I know a lot of people who use it in a World Civ class. I've used it in an early modern Europe class. So I've done it in other kinds of classes, but I love teaching it in the midst of a Reformation class so that we can really spend a couple of days saying, what did you choose and why? Let's look at what people on the ground chose. Let's look at what actually happened. And let's see if we can figure out why they would have made the decisions that they made, because ultimately that's what I really want them to get into. Why was this so complicated? Why did history end up where it was? I don't want them to come at this the way you do in a textbook, like Luther came and then the church was split. And that's not how it happened. It was so much messier and so much more interesting than that. And I want them to see all that messiness. I want them to see all that contingency, what could have happened. This happened. Why did it happen? Why is it that Luther gets all the credit? He was not the most interesting person that was writing and speaking at this time. So we do a lot of kind of looking back and debriefing after it's over, which I think is some of the funnest part. Fun also because with a lot of reacting games, students already know how it ends up. Like they know how it works out.
Yeah.
And with this one, they don't. So when I can introduce hey, here's how they actually did it, and students are always really surprised because they don't know. So that makes it fun. That makes the debriefs kind of a little bit more interesting than French Revolution. They sort of know that, like, After the Constitution fell apart, they built a guillotine. Students know that. They all want to build a guillotine from the beginning. My students do anyway. So that makes this one again kind of interesting because they don't know what the outcome is, and so we can really talk about it.
So one thing I noticed you talking about is actually something that I prioritize in my own religion classes. I mentioned before I teach New Testament in the summers, and so prioritizing nuance and mess and like, no, this is actually not a clean narrative. You know, we look back and we feel like the narrative is clean, but if you look at the moment and the context, it is a hot mess and everybody's all over the place. Diversity of viewpoints, you know, tons of fights over all kinds of things. So do you find that your students embrace that, or do you find they find it unsettling? When I'm teaching New Testament, I have to be extra careful about how they feel because it's so core, right, to a lot of my students' personal beliefs. Whereas the Reformation, it seems like it'd be further away, but I actually wonder about that. Like, do you have students who find it disconcerting?
Sure. I mean, it's you take who you get in a classroom. And sometimes I'll have a classroom where I have people who are very religious or very, very steeped in the New Testament in particular. They know the scriptures really, really well. I have some people in my class that don't, that sort of are vaguely Christian. They don't really know what that means. I get students in class that have never, that are international students frequently, have never grown up in a Christian environment, and they have no idea what's going on. And one of the challenges was, can I make something that a student who has never engaged with Christianity can play through this and be successful and understand what's happening? And at the same time, I can take that student who is deeply engaged with the scriptures and knows the New Testament really, really well and have them learn something new. So that was kind of the challenge that I had going in. I do have a glossary in the back. I have a lot of things, a lot of hand-holding, a lot of kind of, explanations, which I find that even the students today are like, transubstantiation? What? How do we make sense of that? So there's a lot of how could this work? How did people think about that? But one of the things that I've done to try to get away from the kind of modern factionalism is to avoid using the words Catholic and Protestant or Lutheran, because they're anachronistic at this time. By 1530, like, Luther still thought that the Pope was going to call him up and be like, you're right. Like, I'm totally going to fix it the way that you say.
Well, so, like, Christian is an anachronistic word for a good portion of the New Testament class.
Truly. Yeah. No, I mean, we have these categories that we have placed on the past that don't really accord with what was really happening at the time. So the factions that I have in this game are Roman, Wittenberg, and Swiss. So rather than using Zwinglian, Lutheran, and Catholic, which just, that doesn't make sense at the time. Luther's still trying to figure out what he thinks about some of this stuff. Like, it's not a separate denomination. They're not trying to do that. They're trying to fix the one church.
Yes.
And then to get a sense also of some of the other varieties of ideas in there, at one point, the city council has to figure out how to punish Anabaptists, who are the most radical and in some ways the most interesting, the most creative people in the Reformation. They capture a bunch of Anabaptists. Everybody agrees Anabaptists are a bad idea. But what do you do with them? Do we kill them? Do we kick them out? Do we send them to Bavaria to create problems over there? Like, what do we do with the Anabaptists? And I have a secret Anabaptist in the game, who also has to kind of like figure out how to prevent, things that would not only prevent Anabaptists from being like, really persecuted, but prevent them putting things in place that would make it impossible to be an Anabaptist in the city. So, but I try to, kind of move away from modern ideas by not using those words and by just really emphasizing how wild and out there all of these ideas were, and to give the city council a chance to say, pick and choose, little of this, little of that, make up your own thing, figure it out.
Yeah.
And mostly that works. I do try to maintain like very open office hours for students that come in and say, wait, this is not how I learned it in Sunday school. And also students who come in and say, I'm just really uncomfortable with all of this religious language. I don't know how to think about this. This is not something that I've had to do. So I try to be open to those conversations and conversations about why we do this. When I'm assigning roles, I encourage my kids that have gone to Catholic school to be willing to take on one of the Swiss or Wittenberg roles, just so that they can inhabit that other headspace. For some students, they can do that. For some, they just really can't. And so for those students, I try to put them in the place that they're comfortable if they're not willing to be made uncomfortable. So I try to be somewhat sensitive to where they're coming from because I want them to have a successful experience. And if that means I have to take a Catholic kid and put them on the Roman team, I'll do that. And they'll still learn some great things from that.
Oh yeah, I mean, you gotta do what you gotta do. Actually, it leads to a question. So I ask this often about reacting to the past games. I might just have blind spots. I don't feel like it's as big an issue for this particular game, but a lot of reacting to the past games deal with really tough issues like racism. Or actively oppressing other people. And I suppose talking about religion and Anabaptist is about actively oppressing other people. But do you find that there are kind of interactions that you have to prepare students for, or come up with safe space ground rules a bit in order to make the game run? I guess not comfortably, because I don't really think that it's about being comfortable, but like safely and in a way that doesn't get personal and horrible.
Right. I mean, I tell them that my job as a professor is to make them uncomfortable, but I don't want them to feel unsafe. And that's where those things go. I haven't had I anticipated having more trouble with the religion question than I've had. Partly because I think we do a lot of, before we go in there, a lot of talking about, how this is such a different space. You're inhabiting a different headspace. I'm going to be asking you to advocate positions that you might not advocate. You might not care the least bit about the Eucharist, or you may care really, really a lot about it. And I remind them that I want them to be, when they walk out my door, I want them to be the same religion or non-religion that they were when they walked in. I'm not trying, this is not proselytizing. This is not Sunday school. I don't want to change their minds about anything. This is not about affecting their personal faith. This is about understanding other points of view. And so we do spend a lot of time talking about this and a lot of time kind of debriefing that piece of it. There are certain things that I don't do. I had, one of the interesting things is sort of transitioning into a game. How do you go from like, I'm a college student, it's a regular day, I just came from math class, to now I'm in 16th century Augsburg. And this summer when I was playing this game at the Annual Institute, and I had this wonderful student who was one of my leaders, and he wrote a prayer to begin every session. And I thought, well, that's wonderful. And so he wrote a prayer, and we did a prayer at the beginning of every session. And I just thought, I would never do that in a classroom. I would never ask a student to do that, because that feels like that crosses a line for me, that it feels uncomfortable. So I actually so I've been figuring out, how do you make that transition in the prayer? Although I've certainly let this student this summer run with it. He was very creative. It's fine with me if he chooses to do that. But I've really been thinking about, what do I do? And I actually have decided to do some experimenting with sound effects, which is kind of a different, we could talk about sound effects if you want at some point, but
yeah, I'm actually really curious. So like, what kind of sound effects are you choosing?
Yeah, so we are starting, when I play the game this fall, we're going to be using bells. So there will be a ringing of bells that will indicate that it is the beginning of our council session. And so ringing bells will be that kind of auditory cue that you've moved from the 21st century into the 16th century. And I can do that in a way that doesn't, hopefully that won't be something that makes people uncomfortable. I'm not asking someone to perform a religious ceremony of some kind.
Although I played the Catalan game with my Latin 5 kids last semester,
Mhm,
at the end of the last year, and they were
mhm.
totally down to fake a little Roman sacrifice at the beginning of sessions. But it was a
Yeah.
class of 14 kids. We all really trusted each
Mhm.
other. I knew their
Right.
parents. I knew it was going to be okay.
I do some modifications. There's another Reacting to the Past game that uses a kind of religious ceremony to open it up, and that's the Athens game.
Mhm.
And you have to do a prayer to Athena and a pig sacrifice. And I've just changed the prayer to Athena to a hymn to Athena. Or they
Yeah.
can do a poem, but I don't call it a prayer, because I do tend to have students who are very religious, and they're like, "Professor, I realize this is for class, but I'm not comfortable praying in class to like a pagan goddess." Which,
Yeah.
given the fact that I'm
It's
standing in the back
fine.
of the room
Yeah.
dressed as the pagan goddess, I'm like, good, because I don't feel comfortable with you praying to me. So we're good with this.
What? They
So
should get it right.
so that so it's a nomenclature thing. I've just slightly changed it. It's not a prayer to Athena, it's a hymn.
Yeah.
And then they have to sing something. And it's great. And they come up with wonderful stuff. And it's a great transition in kind of thing. So it really just depends on your group and the students and being aware of where they're at.
Yes.
When you're talking about sort of pagan ceremonies from ancient Rome, that's a little different from something that looks like something that you might do at the beginning of a Sunday
Yeah.
school
Oh,
class.
I think that's
So,
true. Yeah, I mean, I
um,
still get a little bit riled up about the fact that we still have a prayer at the beginning of every school board meeting in my district. So I
oh, is
100%.
that right?
Oh, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I've been on the school board in Vermont for 11 years. I think yeah, that would not happen here.
Yeah.
That would not happen here. So,
Oh, man. So here's
mhm,
a question. Speaking, I feel like when we talk about religious issues, every time you talk about history, there's two strains, right? There's what happened or what I think happened. And then
mhm,
there's the story that we're telling about ourselves when we tell about history. And
right.
I don't think you can ever fully separate present and past because the person telling the
Mhm,
history and the history are intertwined at the moment of making
right.
history.
Sure.
Um, so I feel like I feel like the most true place for that right now in the United States is when we're talking about religion. We are
Mhm,
existing in a community where we are all fighting again about whether this is a Christian nation, what that
right.
means, who should get to run the show, what our laws should look like based on people's personal religious beliefs, while also claiming that everybody gets to have their own personal religious beliefs. So, how are your students taking this game and applying it to their own lives? And do you get to see a lot of that happening? And if so, like, what are their takeaways from this experience?
Yeah, I actually think I think you're asking that question. I think it's a really important one. A lot of the students in my classroom are military students. I tend to, we get those majors in history and studies in war and peace. A lot of these students are going to go be leaders in the military. They're going to be officers, and they're going to be interacting with and operating in cultures that are very different from their own, and they're going to be leading other military personnel who have very different religious beliefs. And so it is really important for me that they be able to understand that difference and respect that difference. That is really, really huge. That is the reason. That's why I tell them, why are we talking about the Reformation? You may not care, but at the end, you're going to understand why people have ended up in such different places, and frankly, why people are willing to die for their beliefs. I mean, Ulrich Zwingli, who came up with a lot of the ideas that my Swiss faction is putting forward, he died in battle in 1531. He decided, to kind of like at the point of the sword, go convert the Catholic town next door. Um, People did this, like they die for their religious beliefs, and a lot of my students need to understand why you would do that. Um, this is a fairly safe way to introduce the idea of, hey, whatever you think about religion, people feel real strongly about it, and they have
Mhm.
a whole variety of very, very deeply thought through reasons why they practice differently and believe differently. And so it's just really, really important that they understand that. I mean, that's the whole purpose of this in many ways, is inhabit another person's headspace and understand where this religious difference comes from. why this is so important. And, do I see the outcome of that? I wish I could say I did. I wish I could say the students left my classroom, much more open to talking with people of other religions. I hope that's the case. At the very least, though, I feel like I've given them some tools to understand different points of view on things that people feel very, very strongly about. And a way to understand that, I really like the concept of interfaith, kind of interfaith interaction. So we're no longer thinking about like, well, all religion is the same, or we're just going to relegate it to the private sphere and pretend that there isn't a religion. Interfaith approaches say, let's really understand what other people think and why they think it. And let's really understand not just how we're similar on some of these beliefs, but really how we're very different. Let's just embrace that difference and become comfortable with being different. And I think this embraces that interfaith point of view as well, of trying to say, let's figure out why we really can't get together and agree on how to do the Eucharist in Augsburg. Let's figure out why we can't figure out what art to keep up in the churches. Let's really get down to what's really going on behind these kinds of decisions. And hopefully that gives them the tools that I know they're going to need. I hope this helps to build those skills that they're going to need to be able to be leaders in the military, which many of them are going to do. And those that aren't they go into teaching, they go into law enforcement. I mean, there's many, many things in this world that my students are going to go out and do where they're really going to be able to need to have those skills of being able to understand religious difference, but just sort of differences in general, cultural differences.
Yeah. And I will say one thing I think gaming can do that other more traditional forms of teaching cannot is that they force you into that role and into that conversation in a way that you could have them do a textbook reading and whoosh.
Yeah. No, they're not going to get it from that. They might memorize what they need to do for the midterm, and that's it. And I wanted to go deeper than that. And gaming does that. And that's why I keep doing it. even though it's challenging, even though it's more work, even though it's not a traditional way of teaching, it is so much better. In terms of actually getting me to where I want my students to be.
I like it. So normally at this point, I ask people what they're playing for fun, but I'm not sure that is a fruitful question.
Well, I do have an answer to that, actually. So I do have a teenage son who is very into gaming, and sometimes I'll have him try things out. Like I'll hear about things in class and have him try them out. And one of the things that I was struggling with was how to teach the Holy Roman Empire. Like, what is this thing? Ooh. It's not really a thing. It's hard to have a map of the Holy Roman Empire because it's kind of a blob. It's not mappable. There's not borders. There's not nations in the way we tend to think of it. But the game Europa Universalis does a really nice job of explaining the Holy Roman Empire. So I initially had students telling, as I was struggling with like, Holy Roman Empire, let's see, here's a map. You can't really do a map. And students were like, oh, just like Europa. And so I brought it home. I bought a copy. I made my son play it. And he says, Mom, this is really great. And so I have been dipping my toes into that as a way of seeing if we can understand how video games can help us map the unmappable, which Europa does. And I'm not the person who I will not be developing video games. I must say, like, this is not going to happen. But I'm seeing some real benefits to students. I wish that I could require students, like, everybody play Europa. You'll totally get why the Holy Roman Empire is a mess. Unfortunately, it's a little bit more challenging to do that. Some of the students are already doing it, and some of them are like, video games, kind of like me.
I finally bought a gaming PC to play Europa Universalis, and I took one look at the interface, and I'm like, let me warm up.
There's a pretty steep learning curve to get into it, and that's kind of where I'm at, because I'm really intrigued with this idea of video games as maps. So I'm playing a bit. I'm playing a bit with that.
Fantastic.
But yeah,
Also,
yeah.
those of you who are listening, the end of season 6 had an episode about the board game version of Europa Universalis, and my episode
Did
Brett
not know there was a
Devereaux from a
board
little
game.
while back, I'll link it in the show notes, also talked about using how students learn about history through video games.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's and skills as well. I have a colleague who's doing research on how much better pilots they can be. Fighter
wow,
pilots if they're video gamers, which is very
that's
interesting.
fascinating.
It's fascinating stuff. I mean, I embrace it. I think gaming is absolutely fantastic. So anyway,
But
yeah,
that's awesome.
as a middle-aged like mom, I'm I'm not the target audience for a lot of things, but I'm becoming more and more open to what can I learn from this? Like this could be really cool.
I'm here for it. So the stupid question I was going to ask, I feel like we all have like little fun facts that we love telling students. And I we mentioned the sausage and things like that.
Oh,
What
yeah.
is like your favorite fun fact or story about the Reformation to tell your students for the first time?
Fun fact or story about the Reformation.
Yes.
I mean, there's so many. There's so many.
Pick the
honestly,
most childish one.
The Reformation was wild. And I feel like if they get nothing else out of my class than like, wow, this was so exciting. There was so much going on. This was not like going to Sunday school. There are a variety of really interesting things that I try to talk about. I'm also trained as a social historian, so I'm more about like what are people doing on the ground rather than like how are theologians arguing with each other. And there are a whole variety of things that people would do and were doing to try to create more space for them to be able to have the kinds of religious ideas that they have. So I spend a lot of time, kind of looking through records about like people insulting each other, using religious terms, there was at one point, there were a couple of apprentices that broke into the bishop's garden and threatened to take it and build a church there. And there was nothing the bishop could do about it because it was really actually theirs. But that kind of like energy among the common people and the things that they did, the anonymous notes that they would leave, threatening this or that, or they'd break into a church and they do something shocking and to desecrate the space and things like that. But one of the ways that I try to get to that a little bit, I'm working on a micro game, which is a 1-session game that gets into that urban revolt that I mentioned earlier, where and the background to it just briefly is that there was a pastor that was saying all kinds of crazy stuff, like not only should the Eucharist prayers be said in German, he would also say things like there shouldn't be monopolies, all of these merchant companies shouldn't have monopolies, and feudalism should come to an end, and all this other kind of stuff, like stuff he couldn't say. So they're like, hey, I'll tell you what, buddy, we'll give you 20 gold pieces and a fast horse if you leave town quietly. So he did leave town, but he didn't leave quietly. And the next day, 2,000 people surround the council house demanding their pastor back. And at the same time, demanding a reduction in the excise tax on beer, larger cups of beer for the basic measure, removal. There was actually several things related to beer, restrictions on what the Bishop of Augsburg could do. And then there was this random guy who like got put in prison for beating his wife and threatened to kill members of the council. And they demanded that he be released. So
that sucks. That's terrible demand.
I mean, so one of the ways I'm trying to get them into like, this is not just about religion, is what do you do with this situation? So you're in the council house, 2,000 people are outside, and this is where I use sound effects again. I have like angry crowd noise. So I put angry crowd noise on so that like they are feeling it. People are angry. And I'm like, what are we going to do? Like, do we bring the pastor back? Do we let him have larger measures of beer? Do we reduce taxes? Do we let this guy go? This wife beater, like terrorist guy? So that they really have to think about all of these things closely intertwined with each other, and just kind of see how, if you're going to throw out religious ideas, you're going to throw out all kinds of ideas, and all new stuff is happening. So yeah, so that's quite a lot of fun facts, but the Reformation is just full of them. Oh, I guess one other thing that I do, Luther I love teaching Luther. He was a moderate when it comes to religion, but the most immoderate person when it comes to language. And so he could insult someone like no one else.
Have you
And
seen
there's
the
a
insult
wonderful,
generator?
yes, the Luther insult generator. I highly recommend to anyone, all you have to do is Google Luther insulter, and you will come up with things that were taken from Luther's writings that are absolutely the sickest burns you can imagine. They're absolutely fantastic. So I give students extra credit if they can use the Luther generator to generate some really good, like, insults against each other.
I absolutely agree. My favorite,
and that's
my
really
favorite
great.
one from there is "You are like a mouse dropping in the pepper."
Luther just he had digestive issues. And so a lot of his metaphors have to do with like digestion, vomiting, farting, like everything. Like everything was a metaphor for like every digestive thing was a metaphor for the devil. It's absolutely fantastic stuff. So he's hiding back in Wittenberg where he's safe, and he's saying horrible things about people, and they're absolutely wonderful, and a little shocking to students. It's sometimes nice to shock them a little bit out of their assumptions about what they might have learned in Sunday school. And these were real people, and they got real angry, and they took this stuff real seriously. So that's a fun one too. Highly recommend.
I will link the Luther insult generator in the show notes for those of you who wish to go down that road. I highly recommend it. And then if
there's a Shakespeare one as well, but Luther does even better than Shakespeare. Honestly, good stuff.
Yes, Lutheran insults are the insults in my opinion.
So fantastic.
So people are going to find you online. Where can you be found?
So I'm actually not very online.
Good for you.
Yeah, I don't Twitter. I Facebook minimally. They can find me through my sort of university webpage, which will link to other kinds of things that I've done. But yeah, sorry, I don't have a really good answer for that one. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I'm just gonna link your university webpage in the show notes.
That'd be fine.
And so for those of you who are out there listening, you probably know by now I am terminally online. I'm everywhere as Beyond Solitaire, especially as like little attempts at Twitter alternatives appear. I just go park my username everywhere because gotta do what you gotta do.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So first, Emily, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been a delightful conversation. I really want to try your game.
Thank you so much, Liz. This has been really fun. Thank you for reaching out to me. So fun to talk about my favorite subject.
Yeah, this has been a blast. I would love to be in your class and play that game. Honestly, like I would have enjoyed it so much.
And come on up to Vermont. You're welcome. We can make a space for you. I'll make you my secret Anabaptist.
Honestly, I would love that. And then for those of y'all who are out there, please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.